Hello, and good morning, everyone, or good day, everyone. Welcome to our webcast series where we discuss traditionally the latest and hottest topic in health tech. Today we have an international audience. We have attendees from Singapore, therefore good day. It must be early afternoon in your local time, and I look forward to the questions and views also from our international markets. Looking at the list of attendees, I see startups, I see academia, I see pharma, medical devices companies. There are students, professional services. So there is a broad audience in terms of their backgrounds. The questions that are pouring in after approximately 35 to 40 minutes of presentation, I look very much forward, me and myself and my colleague, to answer them. And as always, I'm your host. I will moderate this webcast. Our guest today is Gabriel Krummenacher, and he's a principal consultant in our AI practice. He will be sharing his insights about how safe and reliable AI in healthcare is built. We will have this presentation. I will go through a couple of housekeeping topics, but let me first give you an introduction to Zulke for those of you who are not acquainted to what we are doing. Zulke is an international consultancy, technology consultancy, and product development innovation firm. We have approximately 1,300 employees in several markets, starting from Europe. It would be Switzerland, Germany, the UK, and then we go all the way to Singapore and Hong Kong. And we have several verticals. One of the verticals is health, where all the products and projects, which is where we serve medical devices companies, pharmaceutical companies, but also healthcare, are placed. And me, myself, I'm the practice lead for health in Switzerland. As mentioned, the presentation will be about 35 minutes. It will be followed by a Q&A session. There is a panel which you should see where you can jot down your questions. So feel free to also ask us technical questions. So if anything is not working while Gabriel is presenting, you can write down your questions there and we will be taking care of them and trying to resolve. There will be some polls in the presentation. Please be aware of that. It will be shown on your screen. You can vote on your screen. This helps to kind of guide through the topics and put the emphasis on the right spots down the road. For any technical issues, as mentioned, write them down in the questions poll. Once there is a Q&A, there will be the same questions, let's say panel. I will take care of moderating the questions and make sure that most of them, depending on the number of the questions, will be raised. And if not, we will have a follow-up email where we will be answering the still open questions. Also, this webinar is being recorded. So if one of your colleagues has not made it, or you think this is valuable sharing with other friends and colleagues afterwards, it will be on the same page where the registration was. Also there, the link will be provided with an email after this webinar or webcast, and you can go through the content and the presentation again. Yes, with these points and housekeeping topics through, I would like to hand over to Gabriel, who will be guiding us through the presentation, and I very much look forward to the content and to the discussion and to your questions. Gabriel, please.
Thank you very much, Bardia. Very happy to be here. Probably one of the last webcasts from the home office. As Bardia said, so I lead the data science team at Zulke. We do data science projects in many different industries, in many different stages of the product life cycle, but we're doing a lot of medical machine learning projects where we build AI solutions together with our partners and clients, and I'm going to talk about some of them today and share some insights on how we do these medical machine learning or medical AI projects. I have a first question for you, just to gauge a bit where you're involved in this, because AI for healthcare is a relatively broad field. And I think particularly interesting is the field of regulated AI. So you should see a question popping up on your screen. Please vote in this poll. If you're involved in building AI models or software that needs regulatory approval, this is usually, in our case, norms and regulations and guidelines related to building medical products that need a CE marking in Europe or FDA clearance in the US. There's obviously other regulations also in the pharmaceutical world that are also interesting, and I think down the line they are obviously different and have a different impact on product development, but I think most of them have a similar impact on how the machine learning part is done. So I'm just going to look at what you voted. So a large majority of you is involved in actually building these kinds of AI models that need regulatory approval. So this is really nice. We're always interested, of course, also then in the discussion in how you see this field. And I'm going to have some other questions in this talk that are going to be about where you see the challenges and how you approach this. Now, since you're taking part in this webinar, I guess I don't have to convince you too much of the huge potential that AI has in this field. And nonetheless, we think that being able to use AI in a healthcare setting can really change the way we can do medicine. There's this quote by Eric Topol that AI has the potential to restore the care in medical care. Especially in the US right now, there's very little time for patients. So doctors don't have a lot of time interacting with the patients, which is unsatisfactory for the patients first, but also doesn't help the quality of medical treatment, of course. So if we can save time in other parts of what the doctor does, we can actually give back time to the patients. I recently spoke to someone who's working in radiology in Switzerland, and he told me the same thing. So if you are referred to a radiologist, you will never have the chance to talk to this expert. He just sits on his computer and looks through medical images the whole day, and he never actually talks to the people, which obviously isn't that great also for the quality of his diagnosis, because he doesn't have a lot of background on the patient. He cannot go and ask questions. So if you can automate part of this more like less complex part, and we can let the experts focus more on where they can really use their expertise, and we can automate parts of this process with machine learning, this can help actually improve medical care. Now, of course, there's regions in the world that have less access to specialists. So having machine learning models that can support these frontline doctors can also help give access to better quality healthcare in all regions of the world. And then another important topic certainly is early disease detection. So if you can actually spot that someone should see a doctor based on maybe a wearable device or information he enters in some application, we can intervene earlier. So back to you. I have another question exactly about this. There's multiple fields, of course, in AI and machine learning, and also in where they can be applied in a healthcare setting or in a medical setting. And I've listed a few of them. The first one's medical imaging, for instance, in radiology, then just generally diagnostics, so building model that can help diagnose different diseases. Treatment could be an important field. So maybe this could be actually supporting the treatment with drugs. It could be apps that are part of the treatment. Then patient monitoring, for instance, in an ICU setting could be an important part. And then there's others, obviously, that I've missed here. So I would be interested in your opinion on in where you think AI actually has the chance to make the biggest impact in this field. Okay, so I see the answers coming in. Thanks a lot. So diagnostics was voted the most, and then medical imaging, which is no surprise to me, because this is probably also one of the older fields where people have already before there was this somehow more recent interest in machine learning and development in these methods have already done a lot of work in medical imaging. And then diagnostics, I also see it in a similar way, that's a field where that's somehow made for machine learning models to support in diagnostics. And I'll also have this on the next slide. So as you also see it, one aspect of why machine learning has this big potential is that the way we do diagnosis is very similar to a classification model or a regression model. And on top of this, the data is also generated in a similar way. So with each diagnosis we have in a hospital, in principle, so there's obviously big caveats here, but in principle we get a label for each diagnosis, which is really nice, because machine learning, most of machine learning only works if we actually have this kind of labeled data. Also, there's a lot of data generated, be it just generally electronic health records or this kind of imaging data we just talked about. So there's huge amounts of data in this format already that we would expect to train this kind of machine learning or AI models. So that's a reason of why there's this big hope, and also there's a big potential of using machine learning in these fields. The data is, as we've seen, imaging data a lot, or text data, and these are exactly the two fields of machine learning that have made the biggest progress in recent years. So we should be able to actually contribute useful machine learning models for healthcare, and by this also reducing the financial burden, because it's a field that's growing a lot, so the costs are increasing, even growing faster than in general GDP. Now, with using these models, obviously also comes risks, and this is something that's true in general for using AI and not just for healthcare setting. And that's why I have this slide of different examples. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for all of them. This is just to show that yes, there's a lot of potential, and there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of applications where machine learning could be useful. But as soon as this is not just a prototype or a research paper anymore, applying these models obviously has risks, and this is also true in other fields where safety is important. One famous example being self-driving cars, where yes, this is something that's really nice when it works, but there's the risk of these models failing, and here's an instance of a Tesla car malfunctioning and crashing. There's other examples, for instance, Watson, that IBM just stopped this project, basically Watson for Oncology. And here the problem was that this model they built was giving unsafe and incorrect treatment recommendations. They spent a lot of money working on this project, and in the end, nothing really came out of it. Here, one of the problems was that they had problem actually getting access to real data for the kind of treatments and the kind of cancers they wanted to work on, and where they wanted to recommend treatment. And then they had to rely on synthetic simulated data. So a lot of these models were actually not trained on real data, but on synthetic data, which then was part of the reason of why they didn't work so well. There's other issues that are not just safety. So there's always the important issues of fairness and bias, which also crop up in healthcare. One other famous example is using AI in a HR setting, for instance, for screening applicant CVs. And here, Amazon ran into this problem that they built this model to do CV screening for them, but then when they analyzed it more deeply, they found that it would always prefer male over female applicants, and doing this by looking at words that were commonly used in male engineers applications, like executed or captured, and they would penalize resumes where people would graduate from all women's colleges. And so in the end, they didn't use this algorithm. An algorithm that was actually used and then found to be problematic was a algorithm in the US, where the goal of the solution was to prioritize patients for medical care. So if they had too many people, basically was some kind of triage algorithm. They wanted to prefer people where the treatment would have a bigger impact. And instead of measuring this impact or somehow the necessity of the treatment directly, they used cost as a proxy measure. So they said if a treatment is costly, this is because there was a bigger need. So there was a bigger problem, basically. Now, the problem with this proxy metric cost is that they made an algorithm that would predict expected cost instead of directly having seriousness of disease, because they didn't have the data for this. And now, in the end, they ended up with an algorithm that was racially biased and that would prefer giving treatment to white people over black people. And they found that this was because, on average, in the data where they trained this algorithm, on average, black people had less money than white people, so they couldn't afford more expensive medical treatment, which the algorithm they trained then deemed as they have a less serious disease, which wasn't the case. It was just that they couldn't afford more expensive treatment. And so the algorithm actually made the problem worse by now also recommending white over black people for treatment. So what all these examples show is that there's a lot of details and things that can go wrong when these models are being used in practice. And there are also challenges for health, of course, and I've listed some of the important ones here. And the rest of the talk is then going to be how to deal with these challenges and how to overcome these challenges. And I think all of you that are working in this space also recognize these. On the top, one big challenge is explainability. So in a healthcare setting, this is not just a nice add-on somehow. So for machine learning models in other fields, you could say just forecasting something is already enough, and then maybe you want to look at some feature importance to support your model, but this is actually required by law. You can't just have a model that diagnoses patients. You need to be able to explain it to a doctor, and you need to be able to explain to a patient why the model thinks that you have a certain disease, for instance, and this is not usually given automatically by these models. We recommend using simple models over complex models. So instead of just focusing on raw average performance of these models, of raw classification performance, for instance, but also looking at how easy it is to explain these models, and not just training some explanation model on top, but actually directly. For instance, a linear model, if a linear model gets close performance to, say, a neural network, it might be worth actually using that model, because it could be that it's more robust. It could be that it's better explainable, because there's a linear relationship between the features that go into the model and the decision that comes out of the model. So these are by design more interpretable than more complex model in the beginning. It's not just being able to explain the decisions to the users of the model, but also for debugging for the data scientists. It makes it much easier when you know what's going on. Now, reproducibility is an issue, and this is on the one hand, it's just rerunning all your experiments and getting the same results, where automation helps. So even if it's building prototypes, or even if it's you're not going to develop a model and then continuously deploy it in a hospital setting, but having the setup like this allows to train and retrain and change things in an easy way. If all the testing is automated, and if all the pre-processing, all the training is in software, it's much easier to change things, and also to update documentation and things like this. So this is one kind of reproducibility. And other very important kind is actually reproducing performance and results. So it's one of the hardest parts of machine learning in general, and also in this field, is being able to generalize to new settings, or to different settings, to other data, to other patient distributions, to other measuring devices. So being able to get similar results from a lab setting and from research papers in an actual clinical settings is a challenge. Which brings me to another point, which is clinical relevance. So as a data scientist, there's always this idea of taking some data and then classifying everything, or forecasting the future, but it's super important to actually look at how a clinician works, for instance. So if it's about building a model that's then to be used by, say, a doctor, it's usually not super helpful to just automate everything from the beginning to the end with one large model. But it's important to understand how this doctor works and what his current procedures are, and where in this workflow it's actually beneficial to add a machine learning model. This also makes it much easier to make the whole solution transparent. If you have smaller part of software and models that solve smaller tasks than just the one big end-to-end input is every patient data, available output is this patient has this kind of cancer. It's less useful for the doctor, and is also harder to explain and make transparent. So having a clearly defined intended use of what this machine learning model is actually targeted to do, and then continuously validating this performance on exactly this task, and also training and testing the model for exactly the task where it's going to be used, is very important. It's also very important for safety. So this is probably the most important point, and also where AI for healthcare is a bit different from, say, other applications like ad prediction, where if you show a wrong ad, the worst case is it's a bit annoying, and here the wrong diagnosis might lead to a wrong treatment, so the worst case is much worse. Of course, there's a lot of regulation to actually ensure the safety of these models, and we're also going to look at this later. A big part is testing and documenting, and in machine learning, this is not just software, but now you also have to test models, you have to test data, you have to document what you've done in a prototype phase, and what models you've looked at, and so on and so forth. Another challenge is privacy, which is a challenge for machine learning, because the more data you have, the better your models, and the models only work on the kind of data that you've also seen in training. So if you're restricted by laws that say you can't use this data, or patient data that cannot be shared outside of the hospital, this is challenging, because when a model is trained only on one kind of data, it will only work there. There's ways to mitigating this. Of course, you want to have models and software solutions built in a way that you can guarantee that they are secure, so that no one can access the data that is not allowed to. And there's also technology that can allow you to train models on data without having to share them. And I will talk about an example of this later. And as a last point, what helped us to overcome or mitigate these challenges is closely working together, people from the data science team, so the AI experts that actually know in and out how this method works and what the limitations also of the machine learning methods are, together with experts from the regulatory field that have a lot of experience in developing medical devices and software for medical devices, and they can then help the data scientists understand what this means in this setting. All in all, having good machine learning practices is probably already halfway to building solutions that can be used in a medical field. And this is no surprise, obviously, because also for building software in this field, properly building the software goes a long way, and this is the same here. I'll have some more examples on what we mean by this, but I think part of it is obvious. So having really people that understand what they're doing, that are educated and experienced in building machine learning, and that follow clear guidelines and checklists to make sure that the decisions are consistent. Now, since data is so important for building machine learning and data science models, that's also very important for making them compliant. And one very important aspect, of course, is actually looking at the data and not just blindly training models on the data. So understanding for what kind of patient population is in the data set. So any model trained on a certain population can only then be used on the same kind of distribution. So it's not possible to train a machine learning model on one kind of data. So imagine you have data from elderly patients. You'll not be able to train a model and then use it on children, for instance. But there's many other different dimensions to a data set. So actually understanding what these are and how the data is distributed is the most important first steps. Also looking at the class balance, if it's a classification model, so how many diseased, how many healthy patients, how many patients from what type of disease are in the data. And then understanding, and this is one of the tougher challenges, actually, having consistent annotations. And so the target of what you try to predict. Is the diagnosis made in a similar way that is then how the model is being used? This is usually not directly the case, but having a protocol that clearly defines on what we mean by this label. I've recently seen work on monitoring patients and predicting sepsis, where this also was a big challenge. So there's different definition of sepsis and when in this time series is the onset and so on. So this is a big challenge of actually making this consistent also across different data sources or different settings. And then the same is true for the model. Clearly understanding what the model can do and what it cannot do. So actually testing its robustness also outside of the training data, Does it still work if the data is from a different distribution? Does it still work if the data is noisy? Looking at the failure cases one by one where the model fails, and also looking at this not just as a data scientist, but actually as a domain expert that understands if this is surprising that the model fails here, or if this is to be expected, because it's also a hard case, for instance, for a medical expert, and then also communicating this to the users of the model on the performance of the model on different subgroups in the data. So in general, it's important also to restrict access to the data set. So if you have a data set that you want to use to test the model, you need to prevent the data scientists and developers working on the model to access this data, because otherwise they can cheat, be this directly or also indirectly in terms of just overfitting to the test set by constantly looking at the performance on this set and then making design decisions based on this. And also having a clearly defined annotation process, and also a guideline for annotators on how they're supposed to annotate the data. We've designed a process actually to guide through the development of AI and machine learning models for health. It's based on our standard data science process that we use to build all our applications, which has these 4 phases across the whole product development. We refined it a bit, so here you see the classical stages that are not surprising for anyone that is building these kinds of software solutions. So first you process the data, then you do research, find the best models and features, you evaluate them, and then when you've found the models and features, you go in medical device development phase, where you actually build the solution. And then at the end, you also want to validate it, maybe in a clinical setting, and monitor it. And what we've done is looked at in what stages what laws and norms apply, and how we can build this. So what doesn't work is just saying from the beginning, this is a regulated software development, say 62304, and the data scientists have to build all the software they build according to this. A lot of the software they build in this research phase is not actually going to end up in the medical product, so these do not apply. At the same time, you want to make sure that whatever they do in this data science research phase is actually done properly and can then be used. So the output of this phase is still being used in this medical device development phase. So everything they do has to be done on systems that are validated, and the performance of the models they then build has to be thoroughly analyzed, and also the data science research phase has to be documented. So you need to be able to go back and say, we've chose this model because of this and this, and here's, for instance, a Jupyter notebook or whatever the data scientists are using to run these experiments, and summarize this everything in what we call here this algorithm R&D report. And then in the later stages, obviously, all the laws regarding medical device development apply as if it were any other kind of software project. So this is based on our experience with building these models. There's also, at least in Europe, there's more and more guidelines. So the notified bodies have produced a list of guidelines of what they will look on in these kinds of applications. There's also a very old radiology guideline from the FDA from 2012 that still applies, because it's also for building computer-assisted devices for radiology images. That has a lot of helpful advice. And then there's from other countries, from Japan, China. There's also a paper from the BSI which helped us build this process. The FDA surprisingly still has very little public material, but they are also in the process of making more concrete guidelines. So another question back to you. Looking at all of these different challenges and how to overcome these I'm interested in understanding where you see the biggest regulatory challenges. Is this mostly that the laws are still a bit unclear, so there's no very clear specific norms for building AI models? Is it mostly actually showing and proving that the model works well enough and validating these kinds of models? Is it is a challenge that for data science projects we usually use all these relatively large open source frameworks and actually validating them as part of the software stack that's in the medical device? Is it actually getting enough data for training and evaluating how well the model works for your specific use case, or is it mostly like taking research models that you've built and then operationalizing them as part of a medical product? Okay, thanks a lot for voting. So 40% of you said that the unclear regulatory situation for AI is the biggest challenge, and 27% said that getting the data, and 33% said that going from research to prototype, from research prototype to medical product is the biggest challenge. Okay, that's very interesting. Again, not super surprising. I think these are also some of the big points that that we see with our clients as well. So of course, getting enough data is a challenge for everyone, and building actual operationalized solutions in these rather unclear regulatory situation. Now, the rest of the talk is going to be about some example projects that we've built together with partners and clients that also show that it's possible, even though given the unclear situation in a way, but just by the laws and regulations that exist for building software as a medical device, and that also apply to AI and machine learning, it's possible to actually use them and already build these kinds of solutions and not having to wait for more detailed norms for AI models. So the first project I wanted to talk about is something that we did together with the Insel University Hospital. So here we looked at patient reports and how we can classify different diseases. So this was classifying ICD-10 code from patient report. That's useful because on one hand, this is something that they do manually at the moment because they need to, for reimbursement reasons, they need to go through all the patients and assign them multiple ICD-10 codes with the different diagnoses that the patient had based on this medical report. So this is just a summary of all the notes that the doctor, for instance, wrote. On the other hand, it's also interesting to classify patients for retrieval later. So maybe you have blood samples from these patients, and then it's nice if you can go back and say, okay, everyone who had this disease, we want to look at the data again, or for running clinical trials. It's if you can systematically filter across the patient population for the different diseases, that's helpful. So that's something where we used machine learning models to build this solution. This was more prototype, and then the next project is actually a product that's that you can buy. So we work together with Ava, who are building this fertility tracking device to build the model in a compliant way. So what Ava is doing is they're building this wearable device for women that they can use to track the fertile cycle. So the device overnight measures multiple parameters like heart rate, temperature, and so on, and then uses this each day to predict if you're fertile or not. And since this is a medical device, also in the US, AVA had to get FDA clearance to sell the device. And what's really interesting is that this is being sold to consumers. So one challenge is you have a set of training data, and that's maybe, I mean, even if it's not limited, you want to make sure that if someone uses this device, and that's very different from what you've seen in training data, to not actually give a recommendation, because the chance that this is true is not very high, because if the data is so different, the model will have no chance to having learned anything useful. And for device that's being used by a doctor, partly this can be mitigated by just telling him to not use it on certain patients, which is much harder if the device can be bought by consumers. And so here we also looked at models on actually how to notice this. So for instance, if someone has a very unregular period, then you don't want to give them advice based on this device, because it's not something that has been seen a lot. So that's also an important aspect, understanding when your model works and when it doesn't, and also in software on the device, realizing that now you're in a situation where you don't understand enough, and then not giving advice. Another interesting project was a model that is doing differential diagnosis of multiple diseases, and here it was exactly like this. So our client, they had researched a model that could do this very well, and then they wanted to build this device that can then be used by doctors. So this is a software application and with a cloud backend that we built to be used by doctors, entering information about the patients, also doing some measurements, and then being able to diagnose different diseases. Again, here a challenge was the model can distinguish between multiple diseases, but what if the doctor uses it on a patient that has none of the diseases? So if you just have this standard classification model, it's somehow forced to classify the patient in one of the three, even though he doesn't have one of the three. So also having ways of figuring out if the patient is actually likely to have one of the diseases, on top of telling the doctor to only use it if he suspects this, was an important part here. And also understanding how the training data came about, what the labels really mean. So here one interesting aspect is also, and I think this is something that happens often, is the model is so the idea is to sell this to general practitioners, but the data for training, actually the labels are usually from specialists, because there you think they give the most reliable labels, right? So if you have an expert doing a diagnosis, you trust this more, but then the model, you want to use it in a setting where you don't have access to a specialist, which makes the model more useful. So you have this problem of data is acquired from a different setting. So even though you trust the labels more, the distribution of the patients might be different. So actually understanding this distribution and looking at it and seeing, okay, is the data from different kinds of patients because they've seen a specialist, and is that maybe different from patients you might see in a family doctor, was very important here. Another very important, very interesting project is something that we just finished together with AOT. They're a startup building this surgical robot. So they have this device that can cut bone with a laser to, for instance, for surgery on the head. And now what's important is that the doctor knows or the surgeon knows when he has cut through the bone. And one way to support this is with imaging methods. So they have this OCT imaging method that can actually, you can see on images going from hair to bone. So this hair-bone transition and where the laser has cut. So here we also built a computer vision model that can use this image data and then segmenting it in a way to find this border between bone and hair, and also having an algorithm on top of this that can then measure how deep the cut already is, and if the surgeon has already cut through. So this is a model that can now help in this robotic surgery application, which they're now finalizing the documentation to also get FDA clearance. And as the last project, this goes back to this topic of federated learning. Here we've worked together with the AO Foundation for segmenting the spine on CT images, but in a setting where you don't have access to the full data set. And this is interesting because it might be that different clinics want to work together, but they can't or don't want to share the data. And now if you only train the model on one clinic, again, you have this problem of the model not very likely not being able to generalize across other clinics. So if you can train the model on data on a more diverse data set, you get a better model. But if you cannot share the data, this is hard. So there's this approach called federated learning, where instead of sharing the data, you exchange the model. So basically, you send the model during training back and forth between the different participants, and this allows you to train one model that's trained on all the data, but the data does not need to be shared. And you can show that this is possible in a way where you can show that the data cannot be leaked. So you cannot infer anything if a certain patient was in one of these local databases by just exchanging basically noisy versions of the model between the participants. And this is something we did here, and we showed that you can still do high quality segmentation of these CT spine images, even though not seeing the full data set. Now, this brings me already, I think, to the end of my talk. So we still have time also for you to ask questions and comment.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for the inspiring presentation. Now, there is, as you might know, also an e-paper which we have published about medical AI. In the handout section, we will make it available during this webcast. So you should see it once it's uploaded, and then you can download it from your panel. It's a very interesting piece of published piece about medical AI, and I would recommend having a look there. Well, let's have a look at the questions which are pouring in. I have a couple of my own, but also looking at the time, it's only 10 minutes left. Let's go to the attendees. We have a question regarding the data sets for regulatory approval. And it goes, from your experience, how important is it to have different test sets depending on the country where you want to certify the algorithm? Example, FDA in the States versus CE marking in Europe.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you can show that the data you have corresponds to, or that it's okay that you only had data from Germany, but you also want to use your model in France, I think this should in principle be possible if you can show that you don't expect to have big differences in terms of, for instance, the definition of the target or the distribution of people that are going to be where the model is going to be used on vis-a-vis where you trained it. I suspect, so this I'm not sure, but if you then want to go to the US, you probably it's probably hard if you don't have data from the US as well. Maybe not for training, but for testing the model. Because I also suspect that since this is a different setting in terms of healthcare, the data is probably going to be different.
Okay, very interesting. So basically, you would recommend or say you can start training the data with cohorts from Europe, for instance, but make sure that for testing the model, you have access to data and cohorts from the States or from the target country where the algorithm should be applied to.
Or a very good argument of why your test data is enough for your case, basically, yes.
Yeah, okay. There's another question about, the research phase and the regulation there. So basically, what is the difference if you are doing research versus you want to have an algorithm, ML, a machine learning algorithm, approved or cleared by the regulatory authorities to be used in real life settings when it comes to the GDPR, like data privacy? Any insights you can share here?
I mean, in general, the difference between the research phase and the building the product phase is mostly that in building the product, all the code you write ends up in the product. And in the research phase, this is not true. So since machine learning is very empirical, basically, you have to try a lot of different models, a lot of different data, a lot of different features, different applications, and you can do that in a way. I mean, you write a lot of software just for this. So basically, the only important thing is the outcome. So you will have different experiments, and you need to document the experiments, but you don't need to write the software in a way that it can be used in medical product. So it's like natural scientists having like a lab report. You report on your experiments. You still want your code, of course, to be in a repository with all the history. You want to be able to go back. You want to manage changes also for the model and the data in a controlled way, but the regulations are different. So all the software you use there, you have to validate according to different guidelines and norms. So here, computerized system validation is important to show that the product you use to actually make the decisions on what model you use are validated, and all the software you use that ends up in the medical product are deemed software of unknown provenance. And there you need to show, like go through, for instance, if you use a software package, you have to go through all the public bugs and then argue why either they don't impact your solution or fix them, or explicitly write test cases for your usage of the SOUP, software of unknown provenance. So there's different regulatory aspects, and it's also a different way of working. So this is true for any machine learning project. It's more open and researchy, and it doesn't follow classical software development processes. So this going from one to the other is very crucial. So doing the research phase in a way that you can still use whatever you do there in the product, and documenting it in a way that allows you to make these submissions is very important. So this is, I think, a crucial step. With regards to GDPR,
yeah.
I don't think there's a big difference. So the law is somehow independent of are you doing this as a prototype or are you using it, at least in terms of what data are you allowed to use. So even for a prototype, you cannot use data like personally identifiable data if you are also not allowed to use it in the product. It's a bit different for decisions. So the law also says what decisions you're allowed to make with personal data, and then if it's just a prototype that's not deployed, I guess some of the things might not apply, but in terms of just using the data, I don't think there's a big difference.
Okay, So basically, GDPR applies independent of whether it's a go-live product or it's a research project. And in research, nevertheless, it's important to validate your tools, right? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. Now, talking about research and prototypes, you mentioned the challenge that the scale up, from the lab to the real life product is also, when it comes to machine learning applications, one of the, let's say, the major roadblocks. Can you elaborate on this? What would you mean, and how have we overcome that in our past projects?
Yeah, I mean, it boils down to multiple things. So it's on the one hand, usually when you do research, you have one data set. It's a data scientist on his notebook. He trains some model, gets some nice results. But this is just the first step. So the scale up means, for instance, now making sure that this really works. So much more thoroughly evaluating the performance of the model, and maybe also on different kinds of data. And then on the other hand, all these other aspects like making sure, so usually this is in a less controlled setting, but actually what you want to do is have a software that limits access to the data by design, so that you can guarantee that the test data you use to measure the performance of your model has not been seen by the data scientist. So it cannot be that the data scientist himself just splits the data into training and testing. And I mean, there's many different other ways of how you could split a data set, but you need a chunk of data that you know has not been used for developing the model. And you kind of have to enforce this. And then the other part is systematic labeling. So what we do is also build applications that are that allow this labeling in a systematic fashion, where you can actually give it to multiple experts and say, okay, here's the data, we want to have it labeled, and then ensure that also you don't mix up these labels. So a big risk is label leakage. So you want to make sure that in your data set, there's no information that your model can use to cheat, basically. And so there's this famous example of having doctors' pen marks on radiology images, and the model was just looking at these instead of actually content of the image. So all these kinds of things are important. And then once you want to use this, you also have to deploy the model somewhere. You have to build the whole backend and front-end infrastructure. You have to have a process of ensuring that the model you take and then deploy corresponds to the correct data and also corresponds to the correct code. So if you use some kind of pre-processing together with building a model, you need to make sure that when you ship this, you use the same pre-processing for the same model and all these kinds of things. So versioning code and models and data is also an important aspect in going from research prototype to production.
Okay, understood. Very interesting. In the meantime, the handout is available. So if you're interested, please make sure that you click on it. It will be available during our session. And it's also on the website for later on, but here you can just download it. It's very convenient. Now, I have a last question. We are approaching the end of this webcast. You showed our medical AI process. We've heard that this is a very complex topic in terms of how can we get from lab to a real life product. And there, I would like to ask you about the vision and scope phase. Maybe you can show the process again. That is a process that we are using every time we work on such topics with our clients. And what happens in the vision and scope part, and why do we have it included as part of the medical AI process that we advise?
So, I mean, this is a very crucial phase in general. It's about actually understanding the problem and building the right solution for the problem. So it's understanding where can you use a machine learning model, what impact will that have, actually understanding the current processes and how what kind of solution could be useful for this, and refining the use case specifically. So this is also deciding on target metrics. So how good does the model need to be, which also is important for the data science research phase. So you pre-specify what you expect, how well you expect the model to perform, and then you can actually measure this. And also what you want to measure, so where in the process you measure performance, and how does that translate to metrics you may already be able to measure during development. And then in this setting, it also means specifying an intended use. So where are you going to use the product, on what kind of patients, and so on. So having all this really understanding of the use case is important. But I mean, of course, this is not a waterfall process, even though now, I mean, on this slide, it goes from left to right. This is something that changes. So when you look at the data, when you start doing the research, you might find there's other applications or some things don't work. Then you go back and change the intended use, for instance, so that it actually fits what you're building.
I see. So thank you very much, Gabriel. Thank you very much for attendees for taking the time and being part of this webcast. Thank you for sharing your questions here. Again, make sure that you can download our AI e-paper and be in touch. We are here. You have the contact details. Please approach us for a deep dive into your very specific use cases. And with these words, I wish you a very nice day or a good rest of the day, and be healthy. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.